Hey everyone, it's Kalonda Henry here from Broad Horizon Speech Therapy, and in today's discussion I would like to talk briefly about African American English, what it is, and how to determine whether a client is exhibiting a difference or a disorder. So first and foremost, let's talk about what African American English is, and that is also referred to as AAE. So the term African American English was derived from linguists, and it's been utilized as the culturally acceptable term to refer to language used by African Americans as well as some others who are not African Americans. So often African American English has been referred to as a subset of Standard American English, which is commonly utilized in English speakers. And those are all of the rules and systems that govern English speaking. So the grammatical features, the way we construct sentences and put them together, this is all what makes up Standard American English. So African American English has been looked at as a smaller umbrella under the term Standard American English. So over time it has been referred to as many different things: American Vernacular English. It has been referred to as Ebonics. It has taken on many terms, but now the culturally, socially acceptable term that is most commonly used is African American English, or AAE. So Standard American English and African American English are not identical, and they should not be compared to one another because they do not have the same grammatical structures. They do not use the same rules that govern each other. So often when they are compared to one another, that is where the misdiagnosis comes of diagnosing someone with a language disorder when truly they are exhibiting a difference. So it's very important to note that those two things are not the same. Standard American English and African American English should not be looked at as two identical systems. They should not be compared to one another because they are two separate entities. Now you're probably asking yourself, what does this have to do with speech and language therapy? And ideally, because we need to be able to identify these certain features, this is a very important role for a speech language pathologist to be able to accurately identify whether or not the errors presented or perceived should be taken as a difference or a disorder. And this is something common in the field, that many children may be misdiagnosed because of their usage of African American English and looked at and be perceived as having a disorder when in fact they're really exhibiting a difference. So some things that we can do as clinicians to make sure that we identify the correct features is looking at whether the child truly is speaking African American English and exhibiting those key features, which there are certain things that make up African American English, as I spoke about earlier, in terms of the way sentences are put together, certain grammar that's utilized, certain words being taken away or sounds being taken away, sound substitution. Those are all important features that must be identified. Now, in terms of looking at a student or a client to see whether they are exhibiting a difference and a disorder, one key factor is utilizing the appropriate testing that is specific to that language being used. So again, if I'm utilizing a test that is specifically related to Standard American English but doesn't address some things or key factors that may be present in African American English, it may limit, and it probably will affect the performance on the test, because again, those two things are not identical, they're not related. So if the test does not address those issues, it may seem that the child will score lower on certain areas addressing grammar, for example, if the grammar has not been attributed to collect data from speakers of African American English. And so this is a key part in diagnosis for speech and language therapists and speech and language pathologists to make sure that we look at the appropriate testing for speakers of African American English. So often there are many myths also associated with speakers of African American English. And like I mentioned earlier in the definition of the word, by definition, is that this is the language utilized by most African Americans, but not all African Americans speak African American English. And there are people of different backgrounds and ethnicities that can also speak African American English, dependent upon the community partners and the people they have communication interactions with. That is also going to depict what type of language they utilize. So someone could very well be from a different background and not have black skin and still exhibit characteristics of African American English based upon where they live, where they perform work at, and they may take on those characteristics because of the communication partners that they have. And it's also another myth not to think that people who speak African American English are unintelligent. This sometimes is a preference depending upon the environment. And as we learn how to utilize language, we also sometimes self-develop the skill of code switching. And so there are many professional people and people who have very prevalent jobs in society, and they know how to keep the skill of code switching, and that means that they simply change the way they're interacting and communicating based upon the communication partners, the environment in which they're in. And so those are all key factors. So it is a myth to assume that just because someone speaks African American English that they're unintelligent, because some people can easily go back and forth between the two. And I know myself personally, I speak African American English, and I have developed the skill of code switching, and I can do that in different types of environments. And so it's also been a misconception that speakers of African American English that they need intensive therapy in order to learn how to code switch, in order to obtain certain jobs and certain things. And that must be noted too, that code switching is sometimes a self-taught skill, and in certain situations a person might seek out enhanced vocal skills or perhaps speaking skills for a certain role they would wish to acquire. But that is not to say that they need direct and intensive therapy to sort of take on this attribute that this African American English needs to be corrected, and it needs to mirror standard American English. And that is not the case, because remember, these two things are not identical. They shouldn't be looked at as identical. So if a person is utilizing African American English, that may be the right communication needed for their communication partners, for the environment in which they're interacting in. And so those are all key factors in determining whether the attributes presented are a difference or a disorder. So we really have to be careful when talking about African American English, and one, assuming that a person, because of what they look like, that they must speak African American English, and two, also thinking that that diminishes their intelligence or value as a person because they are speaking a certain language, and that they have inability to code switch because they most verily probably do have that ability, but maybe they're just not exhibiting it at school because most of the people that they're interacting with in school speak African American English, so there's not a high need to code switch in certain situations. So all of this information encompasses African American English at a glance. because it's a very broad topic that can be spoken on for minutes and hours at a time. And I hope that you will take this snippet of information and utilize it and see how it fits with you and your environment or community partners that you take communication exchanges with. And hopefully this information will serve you well. Take care.